We are reading from Brotherhood of Darkness. We are now in Chapter 3. This is the first video of a series of videos in this chapter. The Murder on the Orient Express. Why should we not form a secret society with but one object, the furtherance of the British Empire for the bringing of the whole uncivilized world under British rule? Cecil John Rhodes, 1877. At this point, we must return to our story of the murder on the Orient Express. Inspector Poirot realized that someone had altered the crime scene to confuse him. Then he found a piece of burned paper with two words written on it: Daisy and Arms. At that point, he began to wonder if Mr. Ratchett's murder was related to the murder of Daisy Armstrong. Daisy was a beautiful little girl who lived with her parents in New England until she was abducted by two men. The kidnappers assured Daisy's parents they would return their daughter if the ransom was paid. But when they got the money, they murdered Daisy and fled. One of them was apprehended, tried, and sentenced to death. Shortly before he was executed, the condemned man revealed that his accomplice was a man named Crosetti, but Crosetti was never found. Daisy's mother was overcome with grief and died while giving birth to a stillborn child. The police suspected the Armstrongs' maid was involved in the kidnapping, and they questioned her repeatedly. Although the young woman was innocent, she became despondent, jumped from a window, and died. Daisy's father, Colonel Armstrong, was a retired Army officer. Faced with 4 tragic deaths, he took his own life, so there were 5 deaths associated with Daisy Armstrong's murder. When Inspector Poirot assembled the evidence, he noted that everything pointed to the fact that Mr. Ratchett was the second kidnapper, Crosetti. And when he questioned the passengers, he found that several of them had known the Armstrongs. One was Mrs. Armstrong's godmother, another had been the Armstrongs' cook. The family chauffeur was there, as was the father of the girl who committed suicide. Could that have happened by accident? New clues kept appearing, and it soon became apparent that they were all designed to conceal the identity of the person or persons who had murdered Crosetti. In many ways, we face the same dilemma today. How can we possibly determine who is responsible for our problems when there are so many clues and so many suspects? At this point, I must tell you how I came to write this story. In the early 1960s, I was a busy young orthopedic surgeon, and like most people, I was unconcerned about what was going on in the world. Then someone told me that our State Department brought Fidel Castro to power despite the fact they knew he was a communist. I couldn't believe that was true, but after reading the Senate report on the fall of Cuba, it was obvious that someone in our State Department had betrayed the Cuban people. At that point, I realized that something was seriously wrong, and I set out to determine who was responsible for establishing a communist bastion 90 miles from our Florida Keys. I began to read and study. Initially, I read about the Bolsheviks and how they murdered 60 million people after coming to power. Then I learned about the millions of women who were raped in Eastern Europe after World War II, and how we financed the Soviet occupation forces that carried out that atrocity. Elsewhere, I read about the 40 to 80 million Chinese who were butchered after our State Department brought Chairman Mao to power, and the 15 to 20,000 American soldiers who were abandoned by our government and allowed to perish in Siberian prison camps following World War II. Then I read about Operation Keelhaul It involved the forced repatriation of 5 to 6 million Russians and Cossacks who were held in Western nations at the end of World War II. Many of them committed suicide rather than return to their homeland, and most of those sent back were either executed or sent to Siberia to die working in slave labor camps. I wondered why I hadn't learned about those things when I attended the University of California as an undergraduate student, and why I hadn't read about them in some news magazine. At that point, I began to suspect that someone or some group was censoring our news, and that realization motivated me to continue my search for the truth. In 1962, the communists controlled Russia, all of Eastern Europe, half of Germany, North Korea, China, Cuba, North Vietnam, Laos, and Indonesia. In addition, Syria, Algeria, Iraq, Libya, India, Egypt, Burma, several South American nations, and several African nations were Soviet client states. The American people should have been concerned about what was happening, but they weren't. In 1963, I read Renee Wormser's book, Foundations, Their Power and Influence. It was the story of a congressional committee that was asked to evaluate the tax-exempt foundations to determine what they were doing with their funds. Congressman B. Carroll Reese of Tennessee led the committee, and despite repeated efforts to block this investigation, he discovered that the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the Carnegie Foundation were using their grant-making power to finance communist organizations and destroy the love every American should have for his way of life. That didn't make sense. Why were the tax-exempt foundations trying to destroy our nation? Then I read Dan Smoot's book, The Invisible Government. It described the Council on Foreign Relations and how it interlocked with the tax-exempt foundations, the State Department, and the leaders of both political parties. In those days, the CFR was the most powerful organization in the United States, yet most people have never heard of it. In 1964, I read Phyllis Schlafly's book, A Choice, Not an Echo, which introduced me to the Bilderbergers, and later I learned about the Trilateral Commission and the Club of Rome. When I studied those groups, I discovered they were committed to forcing the United States to accept the rule of the United Nations, and they were working closely with the communists. The more I learned, the more confused I became. Why were people of great wealth working with our enemies? Well, we'll find out in the next video, and this is Chapter 3, The Murder on the Orient Express. And that was video number 1, and I will see you in video number 2. Stay with me.